Hello, Bio 220 students, once again. This lesson will be on Chapter 12, the Eukaryotes, Fungi, Algae, Protozoa, and Helminths. For fungi, mycology is the study of these organisms. They are chemoheterotrophs, which means they decompose organic matter. They are aerobic, so they prefer oxygen, or they could be facultative anaerobic, which means that if oxygen goes away for a time, they can still function. For vegetative structures, there are molds and fleshy fungi. The fungal thallus, which is the body, consists of hyphae filaments. And there is a mass of hyphae. When a massive or collection of hyphae occurs, that will be called the mycelium. There are septate hyphae, which contain cross walls. Conocytic hyphae, which do not contain septa or perforations, separations. There are also vegetative hyphae, which contain nutrients, with aerial hyphae are involved with reproduction or the disbursement of spores. Characteristics of fungal hyphae. To continue vegetative structures, there are yeasts, which perform non-filamentous and are unicellular organisms. Budding yeasts will divide unevenly. Essentially, a new yeast cell will branch off of an old one. But there are also fission yeasts, which will essentially divide evenly from one yeast cell to two new ones. In the case of dimorphic fungi, they are yeast-like at 37 degrees Celsius and mold-like at around 25 degrees Celsius. Budding, this is just an example of budding, which involves a beginning parent cell and then a daughter cell branches off at one section of that original parent cell. And bud scars can form where one bud originally branched off and broke off. In the case of mold-like and yeast-like growth for fungal dimorphism, essentially what we're seeing here is at the warmer temperatures for yeast-like growth, they are forming colonies or circular colonies, whereas in mold-like growth they are forming what appears to be strands. For the life cycle of fungi, they reproduce sexually as well as asexually, in the latter case via the formation of spores that detach from the parent and germinate into a new mold organism. In the case of asexual spores, they are produced via mitosis and regular cell division, formed by the hyphae of one particular organism. For conidiospore, they are not enclosed in a sac, whereas Arthropods, they are the fragmentation of septae or perforations along the hyphae. There are blastoconidia, which are buds off of a parent cell, Chlamydoconidium, which are spores within a hyphal segment, and then there sporangiospore, which are enclosed in a sac. For sexual spores, these involve the fusion of nuclei from two opposite mating strains. And then the three phases of sexual reproduction for fungi involve plasmogamy, which is a haploid donor nucleus, penetrates the cytoplasm of a recipient cell. Karyogamy, where the plus and minus, or the donor cell and the recipient cell, fuse and form a diploid zygote. Haploid essentially means do you have one set of chromosomes, where diploid means you have both sets of chromosomes. There is also meiosis, which is when diploid nucleus produces a haploid nuclei, which are sexual spores that can then bond with other haploid nuclei to form a diploid nucleus later on. For nutritional adaptations, they'll typically grow better at a pH of 5, so slightly acidic. They will grow in high sugar or salt concentrations and are very resistant to osmotic pressure, outside forces. They can grow in low moisture content, and they can metabolize complex carbohydrates. There are medically important fungi such as Zygomycota, Microsporidia, Ascomycota, and Basidiomycota. For the first situation, Zygomycota, they are conjugation fungi. They have coenocytic hyphae, and they are produced asexually through sporangiospores or produced sexually through zygospores. A zygospore is simply when nuclei of two similar cells fuse together. And this is just a life cycle of Rhizopus, which is a type of zygomycete, showing both its asexual cycle and sexual option as well, sexual reproductive option as well. In the case of Microsporidia, there is no sexual reproduction that has been observed, but probably it will occur, typically it's proposed, in a host environment. There are no mitochondria as well, and these are obligate intracellular parasites, needing to obtain energy from other organisms. And this is an example of the life cycle of Encephalatozoon, which is a microsporidian, a type of fungal parasite. For Ascomycota, these are sac fungi that have septae hyphae. They're teleomorphic fungi, which means that they can produce sexually and also produce asexual spores. Some are anamorphic, which means that they have lost the ability to sexually reproduce. Now, when they produce asexually, they are coniospores, and when they are produced sexually, they are from ascospores. The nuclei morphologically are similar or dissimilar, will fuse in a sac-like ascus. And showing here is the life cycle of Telomyces, a type of ascomycete. There is Basidiomycota, which is club fungi that also have septae hyphae. They can be produced asexually through candidiospores or produced sexually through basidiospores, which are formed externally on a base pedestal called a basidium. And this is a life cycle for a typical basidiomycete. Diseases from funguses. There are mycosis, which is any particular fungal infection. There is systemic mycosis, which can occur deep within the body. Subcutaneous mycosis, which will occur which is an infection beneath the skin. Cutaneous mycosis, which can affect hair, skin, and nails. There's superficial mycosis, which is localized, for example, to just hair shafts. And there's opportunistic mycosis, which are fungi harmless in in their normal habitat, but they can become pathogenic in a weakened or compromised host. There are economic effects of fungi, and some are useful, such as Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which can be used in bread, wine, or formation of the hepatitis B vaccine. There are those called trichoderma, which are used for cellulase, taxomyces, which forms the chemical Taxol, entomophaga, which are used for biocontrol. There's Coniotherium minitans, which help kill fungi on crops, and there are Pacilomyces, which help kill termite infestations. Now getting into lichens. They're a mutualistic combination of green algae or cyanobacterium and a fungus. It's essentially, lichens consist of two organisms, one of which is a fungus, and both organisms help each other. There is crustose, which are encrusted on the substratum. There are foliose, which can be leaf-like, and then there are fructicose, which are finger-like lichens. In terms of the thallus, or the body of lichens, they are made out of medulla, which are hyphae grown around algal cells, rhizines, or holdfasts, which are hyphae projections below the body, and then there are cortex, which are protective coatings over the algal layer. Lichens are typically found across many plants and rocks in forests, especially around the state. What's shown here is simply the fungal part of lichens growing around and encapsulating the algal organism in lichens, and where essentially one will help feed the other. In this situation, the alga units or colonies will produce and secrete carbohydrates, which the fungus will enjoy, and the fungus will in turn provide holdfast, or essentially a safe location for the alga to stay. As far as economic importance, lichens can provide uses in dyes, antimicrobial uses for litmus, and also for food for herbivores. Now for algae, there isn't a particular taxonomic group for them. They can be unicellular or filamentous photoautotrophs. They will lack their own roots, stems, and leaves. And they're typically mostly aquatic, and water is necessary for growth and reproduction. But in the case of lichens, the fungus helps the alga sample to actually be on drier areas and on land. And there's just a wide variety of examples of algae. Typical characteristics are that the location that these algae are found will depend on a variety of factors, including the availability of nutrients, the wavelengths of light that are typical in that region, and on the surfaces to which they are attaching. The thallus, which is the body of multicellular algae, consists of holdfasts, stipes, and blades. Characteristics will also include the fact that all algae reproduce asexually. There are multicellular algae that can fragment and reproduce sexually via alternation of generations. Selected phyla or types of algae include the brown algae, which are kelp. They consist of cellulose and alginic acid within their own cell walls. They are multicellular and macroscopic. They exist on larger scales. And they produce algin, which is used as a thickener for foods. Example of algae where the stripe is the long component off of which pneumatocysts will branch off and further blades will occur afterwards. In the case of brown algae. For red algae, they have branched thalli. They are mostly multicellular and they can be harvested for a source of agar and carrageenan, and they will produce a lethal toxin, however. Or some produce a very lethal toxin. Green algae. Their cell walls consist of cellulose, similar to plants, and there are unicellular or multicellular versions. They have chlorophyll A and B, which helps in photosynthesis. They will store starch or large sugar molecules, and they give rise to terrestrial plants. There are diatoms, which involve cell walls made out of pectin and silica cells, or cell walls. There are unicellular and filamentous. They will store oil, and they produce domoic acids, which cause neurological disease. There are also dinoflagellates, which have cellulose inside their plasma membrane. They are unicellular, and they have neurotoxins, such as saxitoxins, that cause paralytic shellfish poisoning. There are also Umacata, or water molds, which have cellulose in their cell walls. They're chemoheterotrophic, and they produce zoospores. They are decomposers and as well as parasites on plants. Roles of algae in nature. Well, they fix or they incorporate carbon dioxide to form other carbon-based molecules. And they actually produce a vast majority, 80% of the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. Algal blooms are when there are large increases in planktonic algae that can result in toxin being released or die and then consume large amounts of oxygen, depleting the dissolved oxygen in water. There are oil production, and they are involved sometimes in symbionts with animals. Protozoa can be or are unicellular eukaryotes. They do in fact have cells with nucleus. They inhabit water and soil, and they can be involved in animal-like nutrition. They will typically have complex life cycles, however. In terms of use, there can be feeding and growing form, which is a trophozoite. When in asexual reproduction, this is done by fission, by splitting a protozoa cell, by budding, the branching off of a daughter cell from a parent cell, or schizogony, which involves multiple fission. There's also sexual reproduction, which is done by conjugation, and some produce a cyst to survive adverse conditions. Characteristics of protozoa is that they require a large supply of water to stay alive, and many have an outer protective pellicle which requires specialized structures to take in food. There are ciliates, wave cilia, toward mouth-like cytosomes for the engulfment of food material. There are also they phagocytize food. Food is digested in vacuole sacs, and waste is eliminated through an anal pore. Medically important protozoa can include those like excavata, which have feeding grooves, called excavata. These would be diplonomads, parabasalids, and euglenozoas. There are also embe, epicomplexa, and ciliates. Diplomonads do not have mitochondria, but have multiple flagella for movement. There are parabasids, which have an undulating membrane, but no cyst stage, and euglenozoa, which are photoautotrophs, or facultative chemotrophs. Hemoflagellates are transmitted by bites of blood-feeding insects and can sometimes cause disease. Embe move by extending pseudopods. Entomyoba histolytica causes amoebic dysentery disease. There is acanthamoeba, which infects corneas and causes blindness. There's also Balamuthia, which causes granulomatous amoebic encephalitis, or inflammation around the head. Amoebae. There is apicomplexa, which do not move around on their own accord. They are obligate intracellular parasites, relying on other organisms for nutrition, and they have complex life cycles. There are Toxoplasma gondii, which are transmitted by cats, and they can cause fetal infections. There are Cryptosporidiums, which are transmitted by feces that cause waterborne illnesses. For Plasmodium, these are examples of apicomplexa which cause malaria. Sexually reproduce in the anopheles of mosquitoes. When a mosquito injects a sporozoite through its bite, the sporozoite undergoes schizogeny in the liver. Merozoites are produced afterwards. These then infect red blood cells, forming a ring stage inside the cell. Red blood cells rupture, and merozoites infect new red blood cells. This is just a detail of the complex life cycle involving numerous organisms for malaria-causing Plasmodium vivax. There are ciliates which move by cilia arranged in precise rows, as well as Balantidian coli, which is the only known human parasite that causes dysentery. Now getting into slime molds. They are cellular slime molds. There are cellular slime molds which resemble amoeba. They ingest fungi and bacteria by phagocytosis, by the engulfment of that material into the cell. Cells will aggregate to form stalks and spore caps that differentiate into spores. For plasmodial slime molds, they form masses of protoplasm with multiple nuclei throughout, and they move as a giant amoeba. For cytoplasmic streaming, the protoplasm moves and changes speed and direction to distribute oxygen and nutrients. And then getting into the last type, Helminths. Helminths are parasitic worms, and they consist of just two phyla. Platyhelminthes, which are flatworms, and then Nematoda, which are roundworms. They have characteristics in that they are multicellular eukaryotic animals, and they specialize to specific hosts. They may lack a digestive system, have a reduced nervous system, a reduced or lacking ability for motion of their own accord, and they may have complex reproductive systems involving more than one organism. Dioecious are examples where they can be broken into a male and female type. And then there are monoecious, or hermaphroditic types, where male and female reproductive systems are in one animal. And they undergo a life cycle of an egg to larvae to adult. Platyhelminths. They have trematodes or flukes, which are a type that has flat leaf and are leaf-shaped. They have ventral or oral suckers. They absorb food through cuticle coverings, and there is an example called Paragamestes, which is an example of lung fluke, and there's Schistosomo, which are blood fluke infections. Very nasty creatures. For cystodes, examples including tapeworms, there are scolex, which is a head that has suckers for attachment. They absorb food through cuticles, and then the proglottids have body segments that contain male and female reproductive organs. Cystodes use humans as their definitive hosts. Eggs from proglottids are ingested in some way. They will hatch into larvae, and then they bore into the intestinal wall. They will produce cysticerci, as well as there are Tanae solium, which are a type of pork tapeworm. For cystodes that use humans not as the final host but as intermediate hosts, eggs will be ingested and hatch in the intestine. Larvae will migrate to the liver or lungs and develop into a haptidid cyst and then become Echinococcus granulosus. Although typically in the life cycle of a human, it will be a dead end and they will not reach their next desired host, which involves deers, and then their defined host, which is the wolf. Nematodes, which can include roundworms, roundworms in particular are cylindrical and they have a complete digestive system for digesting nutrition. They can be dioecious, where males contain spicules, and they can be free-living and parasitic. Nematodes will have eggs that are infective towards humans. Examples include Ascaris lumbricoides, which infect human intestines, Basilocercosis procyon, which are raccoon roundworms, Trichuris trichiria, which are whipworm, and then Enterobius vermiculus, which are pinworms. Again, very nasty parasites. The larvae are infectious to humans, and there are forms of larvae which are the strongyloids, re-emerging infection. There are Nectar americanus, or I should say there's a type of larvae called the strongyloids, which are becoming more prominent in infectious cases. There are Nectar americanus and Ancylostoma duodenale, which are hookworms that enter the skin and are carried to the intestines. There are Durofilaris immitis, which are spread by mosquitoes and cause heartworm disease in multiple animals. Example of a heart's organ that has numerous heartworms fully grown inside. Always give your pet its heartworm medication. Definitely never skip out on that, or else it would be a very, very painful experience for the animal. For using arthropods as vectors of transmission, arthropods are animals with segmented bodies and hard external skeletons, and also jointed legs. The vectors are arthropods that carry pathogenic microorganisms, where the term vector means a source for spreading a particular pathogen. Representative classes include the Arachnida, which have 8 legs, Crustacea, which have 4 antennae, and the Insecta, which have only 6 legs. And then there are blood-sucking mosquitoes and ticks, which can be vectors for parasitic or pathogenic organisms. Now, they can cause disease or be a vector for causing and spreading disease through mechanical transmission, such as injection or stinging, biological transmission, where the pathogen multiplies in the vector first before going into the desired host, and then there's a definitive host, where the microbe's sexual reproduction takes place in the vector. And that concludes this sizable PowerPoint for Chapter 12, dealing with eukaryotic pathogens. In any case, it is a pleasure once again to have you all for this Unlike Microbiology course. I am hoping you're all handling the wide variety of information that was put into this course, and I truly hope that you're all finding the strength to continue forward. You're all doing well, and I still have continued respect for each and every one of you for taking such a girthy course during a shortened summer. Peace out to all of you.